So hello, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Europe, and I apologize. It is quite early here, so I'm speaking to you from my kitchen, because my family is asleep, and I realize how bad the lighting in my kitchen is. It's very bright, but fortunately, you will not be seeing my face this entire time. I will be switching to screen share mode. So let's do that now. One moment, please. You'd think after 3 years of Zoom, we'd all know what to do. And yet every time there's some little snafu. Okay. So I know you've just had a leadership activity and you're probably a bit tired, but I am going to ask you to stay with me for just a little bit longer because we are going to be talking about a really important part of decarbonization, which is city design. So can anyone tell me why city design is an important part of any net zero program? Anyone at all?
Professor?
Yes, go ahead.
Actually, mostly it is seen that there are different kinds of sectors that have been emitting, and for this one is the major part is the residential area. So I think it is very necessary for the decarbonization of the residential area, and also there are some of the industries or something in the city, so it need to be decarbonized. So it is very important for sustainable urban decarbonization.
Thank you, AJ. So that's a very good point. Emissions are often coming from residential areas in urban regions. Who can tell me what's different now in cities than, say, 60 years ago? What's happened to the planet with humans and cities? Are there more of us in cities than ever before? Are there less of us? What do you think?
May I say something? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. More people are migrating to cities, and
Correct.
they're getting more populated, and that kind of results in the resources are limited, but the population keeps rising, and so there's this competition between resource management and also meeting the demand of people. So this comes at a cost of high pollution, lower well-being of people. So we need to manage both the environment, well-being of people, and also the resources in that limited extent of land.
Correct. So a few years ago, what happened for the first time is we had more human beings living in urban areas than we did people living outside of them. And where people exist, carbon gets emitted. Not only carbon, but lots of greenhouse gases. But as we talk about net zero, often we talk about carbon emissions. However, cities also are huge potentials in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So again, I'm going to switch to the next slide. Does anyone know what city this is? Take a wild guess. Someone who hasn't spoken yet. It's going to be a very long lecture if you just make me talk the entire time. Yeah, it's Tokyo. This is an area not too far from the UNU building where I got to work. And what do you notice about this city space?
It is more human friendly than technology or car friendly.
Pedestrian friendly, maybe.
Excellent point. So 2 points. Human friendly and pedestrian friendly. Pedestrian friendly is really critical in decarbonization, which we'll get to in a minute. Honestly, walkability and multimodal transit sector emits a huge proportion of greenhouse gases, especially around human residents. But if humans can walk between places, it reduces the need for vehicle transit. The other comment that I think the other speaker was getting at was human friendly. So you see a bunch of shops and business facades on the first floor of these buildings. What do you think's above them though?
These are residential spaces for the owners, most probably.
Absolutely. And when we have residential spaces mixed with businesses, it tends to be a healthier urban environment and it tends to be lower in carbon. Now, getting back to my first point of walkability and transit, why is mixing where we get our groceries, where we go to school, where we do a lot of our activities, why is it a lower carbon activity often to put those closer to residences than farther away? And the answer was in the first talking point.
It reduces commute.
Exactly. You're reducing the commute, and you're not only reducing the commute, you might not have really to use a vehicle for any commute at all. Okay, so I come to you not as an urban planner, but as someone who worked and grew up in the United States of America. This is a typical neighborhood in an American city. What do you notice in comparison to the Japanese example that I just showed you?
This neighborhood is built mostly for cars.
It is
not for
definitely
humans.
built for cars.
I guess all the residential area is clubbed together.
Correct. And what would you notice about what type of residential areas these are? Are these like apartments that are using the same heating and water systems? What
These
type
seem
of
to be
buildings are they?
Separate bungalows.
Single house
Separate
land use.
bungalows.
Yep. These are all bungalows or single family homes. Some of them, as you'll notice, a few of them have sidewalks in front of them. About half of them don't. They're only accessible unless you walk in the street, which might not be safe because of vehicle traffic, or if you are actually in a vehicle. All right. So these are just some very simple early examples, but I want you to start thinking about not only cities themselves and the infrastructure, but how that infrastructure is placed in position to one another. So we call that concept zoning. How do we zone infrastructure within cities? And how does that play in to being a net zero solution or a major greenhouse gas emitter? So how is space used in an urban setting is one of the first things when we started designing this program that I noticed was a really sharp difference between East Asian countries like South Korea and Japan, and where I grew up in North America, in the United States, as well as Canada. So the first example that I gave you that Tokyo is actually a really good example of is mixed-use zoning. So mixed-use zoning is basically just urban development that blends multiple uses, such as residential, commercial, but also cultural, institutional, like city offices. Where do I go for my records? Where do I go to register a marriage or a death in the family? Entertainment venues like theaters, and recreational spaces, whether those are parks or sports fields. All of those occurring in one neighborhood is what we call mixed use zoning. And as one of your colleagues said, mixed use zoning usually means less transit emissions. You can walk or bike to things that you need for supplies or services. Goods and services tend to be accessible by walking, biking, or mass transit. So you not only have a decrease in traffic, but you have an increase in human foot traffic, which often has health co-benefits. Oftentimes, though not always, a mixed-use zoning space is associated with a more diverse and inclusive neighborhood. That doesn't just mean one aspect of diversity. You tend to have multi-generation households that are able to live next to single people, that are able to live next to what we think of as nuclear families. And the inclusivity is usually related to access, because you don't need a car to access the goods or services. A wider breadth of people can actually access these. So it doesn't only have environmental benefits, but there are actually social benefits if we value inclusivity as part of city design. The other thing I think is really key about mixed use zoning that I did not grow up with in North America is it allows for socialization in a public, something that we call the third space. Now, some of you might be well familiar with this, but there's this idea in social science that there's three spaces. The first space is the home, the second space is work, and the third space is where all the rest of life happens, where some of us might say all the really good stuff, or at least some of it. And that space is just public third space. And as I said, you'll find many examples of this in Tokyo. You'll find neighborhoods where there's not only a lot of residential high-rises, but at the base of those high-rises, you have business, you have city office buildings, you have clinics, you have schools, you have entertainment venues, and often you'll just have public recreational spaces, whether that's a park or even just a bench for people to sit on. Contrasting that is a model of single-use zoning. Single-use zoning is a pattern of urban development that not only codifies a single use for a residential space. Often these are single-family homes, but it tends to make goods and services accessible primarily by a private vehicle. This not only increases traffic, but it decreases the amount of exercise humans get during a day, which also has health repercussions. And single-use zoning, what we see in a lot of countries that use this, especially for single-use zoning of single-family homes or bungalows, is these are more often associated with segregated and exclusionary neighborhoods. The reason for this, or at least one of the reasons, is that we have limited socialization with the family still occurs in single-use zoning. So that's your first space. Or it might occur with coworkers if you're in, like, say, an industrial zoned region of the city. The second space is a workplace. But there really isn't any of that third public space in a lot of single-use zoning. So again, rather than the United States, that's a Canadian suburb, but you see the pattern. So why is a third space important for cities and also for decarbonization? Well, a lot of the interesting things that happen in our life happens in the third space. It's a neutral ground, so people from all walks of life can occur there, and you create greater cohesion between communities rather than atomization. That means it's a leveler. Anyone can access a park. It means that you can be in any type of sector, or at least many different types of sectors, different types of neighborhoods, different types of cultural traditions, but everyone still uses these common spaces. And because of that, it encourages conversation as the main activity. When you're in your home or when you're in your place of work, you tend to be very task focused, whether that's on child rearing or caregiving in the home or doing work tasks within the workplace. Third spaces are also accessible and accommodating, basically looking at inclusivity as a value within the third space. So you get to know your regulars, you get to know people, and that creates more of a sense of community. They're also relatively low profile. You don't feel that you're on stage in a third space, like you might in the home or in your workplace if you're put on the spot, but you're allowed to socialize kind of more organically and keep a low profile if you so choose. Essentially, it's a home away from home. And what we're finding, and unfortunately, is that digital third spaces tend not to be as effective at building community or at decreasing our environmental impact as we hoped they would. Now, there are some really interesting examples of online third spaces, but when it comes to creating a neutral ground where you meet many different types of peoples, we tend to self-segregate into like very specific clusters in online communities. And there's power in that, but it doesn't play the same social role as a neutral ground for kind of accessible socialization in a given geographic location. Okay, so why am I telling you this? Well, why did zoning start? For most of human history, we didn't really have a concept of zoning in most societies. Human settlements used mixed zoning. People worked where they lived and they socialized in many of the same spaces. This changed a lot during the industrialization period. So what happened in this period at the end of the 19th going into the 20th century was residential zones began to be separated in order to keep households away from harmful substances that factories would emit into the air, water, and soil. We don't want school children or the elderly breathing in toxic substance from factories. The problem with this is, like with many things, good intentions led to terrible consequences. So for example, in the United States, zoning, while it was used as a ruse for public health, was actually used to create separate residential areas for non-types of residential zoning, including commercial, agriculture, entertainment, or transit. And the reason for this was often coded as a public health. Well, we can't have people living next to an industrial zone or a work zone. Unfortunately, oftentimes zoning was used as a weapon. The reason zoning became codified in a lot of local US laws really wasn't connected to health concerns about exposing to toxics, but was used as a tool for racial, ethnic, and class segregation in cities. So in this way, unfortunately, we saw public health weaponized to create separation and segregation. Why does this relate to the environment? Well, because with single-use zoning, we saw a great increase in greenhouse gas emissions in order to connect these residential communities to the goods and services that they needed, as opposed to mixed-use zoning. So when health concerns were not seen as valid, we start seeing concerns in the 20th century pop up about safety for children became weaponized. Again, there's no evidence that children are safer in a mixed-use zoning than single-use zoning. And now increasingly around the world, we see arguments focus on the quality of adjacent services. But honestly, a lot of the times these still relate to wanting to segregate. Modern zoning from the US is sort of the fruit of a poisonous tree. And with that tree came an intense environmental impact, because we not only had so many people moving out to these suburbs that were not connected to goods and services, but they were still demanding access to these goods and services. And in order to do that, they needed vehicle traffic. Modern zoning law is often used in the US at the local level to discriminate against a lot of other different types of people. I could go into this in great detail, but we have to move on. This map, in case you're interested, is a look at how zoning is used in the city of Atlanta. So take a look and feel free to ask me a question. A low carbon city tends to be a city that used mixed use zoning with high density. And Japanese cities are a really good example of this. Japanese cities are able to do this because they're well connected with multimodal transit, which tends to make the greenhouse gas emissions of the average city dweller in Japan quite low compared to that of city dwellers in other nations. Good connectivity, good walkability, mixed use zoning within the neighborhoods that people are living means you decrease your carbon footprint. So what factors in urban development make this possible? Well, Japan actually has relatively liberal zoning laws and density controls compared to many other nations. Public services in Japan, such as school, are not funded or administered at the local level, and therefore residents in a given neighborhood are often not incentivized to use exclusionary zoning to maintain quality of a service. The service is expected to be the same wherever you go within the schools around the country. Residential property is also not framed as an investment in much of Japan, and therefore often residents of a given city may not be incentivized to restrict supply of housing. That means more high density housing is possible. And also urban administration in Japan has avoided codifying local land use planning into local law. This has made it harder for homeowners to manipulate zoning regulation for their own interests at the expense of the wider community. All right, so that's laying the groundwork of how it's important to think of infrastructure and how it's positioned to each other as a part of a low carbon city. I'm just going to escape for a second to check the time. How are we doing for time, timekeeper? Can you let me know? Because I can't see.
You have about 20 minutes left.
Perfect. Thank you, Miki-san. All right. So what do we do with the individual pieces of infrastructure that are in a city? Well, buildings after transit are a big step. And most of the time, despite what architects might want to tell you, the building with the lowest carbon footprint is the one that has already been built. There are exceptions, but oftentimes transitioning existing buildings to lower zero carbon can not only is lower carbon than building a whole new building, but it makes these buildings more healthy and comfortable. This is an example from close to where I am in the Netherlands, in the city of Rotterdam. And these are what you want to consider with building retrofits in an urban area for low carbon. So the first is it's critical to create a clear timeline for retrofitting. Again, this seems like common sense, but this is really important because when you're dealing with the building sector, you're dealing with a wide variety of stakeholders. You have individual homeowners, you have businesses, you have municipal properties that are owned by the city government. And in order to create a schedule for retrofitting, the timeline for this schedule needs to be communicated really clearly to all these building owners. You also need to give people the tools of the trade they need to do retrofitting. So it's really critical to provide job training programs for, okay, how do we lay insulation into buildings? How do we rewire for energy efficiency? You need to provide your workforce with the technical skills they need. Talking about principles of aspiration of design is great, but you really do need to install these technical skills for retrofitting into the workforce. Again, this seems like common sense, but when possible, time retrofits to coincide with other building upgrades. So say you're adding a floor to an existing office building, now it's time to retrofit it for energy efficiency as well. Don't create multiple disruptions for people if at all possible. One of the key things in the building sector is try to electrify as many energy components as possible. Some of you might come from places where generators from diesel, gas, or oil are still commonly used. I knew that was common in the city I grew up in. But the more you can electrify infrastructure within buildings, the more you can switch that electricity supply to renewables in the future. And in relation to that, retrofitting any building infrastructure should also be paired with updating the energy efficiency of appliances, machine, and lighting in the building, again, when possible. Of course, you're going to deal with economic constrictions in some places, but trying to synergize is a really key component. And finally, set efficiency standards into industrial building codes and don't allow low efficiency motors to be used and adapt motor upgrade requirements for industrial energy users. Now, when I'm talking about motors, I don't mean a vehicle motor. There are other motors used in industrial buildings, so like factories. These tend to be highly energy intensive. And again, when you're doing upgrades to an existing factory, you want to not only update the building infrastructure itself, but the machinery inside it. Again, the more you synergize, the less disruption it is to people's lives. Keeping that disruption idea in mind, any type of upgrade very well may displace occupants or disrupt operations of a facility. It's smart to work in phases. Try to mitigate the impacts, work one floor at a time, work one section of the building at a time, so people can live their lives and continue on with their jobs with as little disruption as possible. Another big thing with heating is buildings as heating. So how do you develop industrial programs to reduce emissions from heat loads? I'm going to rush through this a little because you probably talked a little bit about this in energy efficiency. But one of the really critical things is to repurpose heat waste within a facility to heat nearby facilities. Japan does a really good job with that. Make process heat distribution systems more efficient. So when you use distribution system retrofits, often lead to immediate quick payback. Basically, the more efficient you make a system, you tend to use less energy, and that's your cost saving. And when you're working with industry, try to make more efficient use of the resources, including the excess heats that's used, rather than just letting it turn into entropy. If you can heat adjacent buildings, even if those buildings aren't housing, if there's some other types of office building, the heat at least is going to something that doesn't have to draw on heat from a different source. And then a good advice is to retrofit city-owned heating infrastructure first. When you're working in city government, you want to be a role model. And so you want to kind of build by design. City zoning laws and ordinances often prevent industrial buildings from sharing heating or waste heat with residential or commercial buildings. So that's one of the first things you'll want to address. Like, does our local laws allow this? And if not, are there safe ways we can turn the laws towards like, okay, well, we can't heat residential buildings. Could we heat something like the storage facility or something? Trying to use the heat rather than just let it turn into entropy, but making sure that you're doing it safely. There's a lot on buildings. Benchmarking is another critical step. This comes from, this is actually from Toronto in Canada. Considerations for reporting and benchmarking. So in order to use benchmarking, which is basically just ways of setting standards, you need to collect, analyze, and publicly report on energy use data. This can be actually a big challenge in areas with poor, inconsistent electrical metering. And so city governments really, again, is leading by example, making sure that you have your own house in order before you start demanding from the household or the private sector. Once data has been collected on energy use in buildings, it's best to develop policies directly addressing high energy consumers first. You don't want to hit the little consumers. You do want to hit those highly energy intensive buildings and try to form some energy savings there before you do a citywide policy. The problem with a lot of reporting and benchmarking is there's lack of enforcement, and there's also less of incentives to make people want to follow the rules. So one of the things you really have to brainstorm from the offset is how to incentivize, and then actually how can you enforce? And finally, building codes. Here we're back in Tokyo. When you're creating building codes, you have to work with city legislatures as well as key figures in the building and construction industry. So remember, you're not only engaging in industry, but a legal process, establishing financial mechanisms to reduce upfront cost for more efficient buildings. Try, again, create local job training programs for advanced construction practices, not just for retrofitting, but for creating new buildings when necessary. And establish priority permitting, for example, accelerated approval or other types of incentives for energy efficient buildings. Give building designers and building retrofiters something to strive for instead of just knowing they did a good deed. And finally, adopt progressive codes for existing buildings. Reduce burdens, again, on small buildings and residential homeowners. Focus on larger buildings that are more energy intensive when you start creating or updating building codes. All right, the big elephant in the room. So transport and mobility. So public transit routes are one of the key factors for decreasing greenhouse gas emissions in urban areas. So this can include bus and rapid transit, light rail, or metro systems. And when you're creating these for the first time in a city, it's often advantageous to deploy them to populous areas, areas with high traffic congestion, areas that have limited access to transit, or areas with high usage of single occupancy vehicles or SOVs. Public transit should serve all residents of an urban area with a focus on underserved populations. Public transit should also include an integration between transit options. You want your riders to be able to switch from a bus to a metro with minimal stress, making it a smooth process so they're not frustrated and start using a car. Public transit should be incorporated into all urban planning decisions. This is one thing to really stress, is that you want residential and businesses to be well connected by public transit. If you're using a system like bus rapid transit, Again, it's best to designate specific traffic lanes for this so you reduce rider time. And it's important to remember that even the best designed public transit options will fail unless you do a really effective marketing strategy on why public transit benefits. Again, you have really good examples of this from South Korea and Japan, where seniors, students, commuters going to their jobs, they're well aware of why transit is more cost effective and saves them time compared to commuting by car. But without those systems, lots of other cities don't have successful transit schemes. Another thing to think about is introducing mobility alternatives, such as bike infrastructure or pedestrian walkways. This is, again, in Europe, where I am, in a city of Poland. I think this is Krakow. Considerations: make streets pedestrian friendly with wide sidewalks, create segregated bike lanes. These tend to be much more effective at encouraging cycling than just painting bike lanes into vehicle traffic lanes. Traffic light signaling should prioritize people traveling by foot or by bike. This is one thing I think Europe still struggles with quite a bit. There's infrastructure there, but the signaling system still prioritizes cars, which frustrates people and pushes them back into vehicles. Intersections should be redesigned to maximize safety for people rather than speed of traffic. Again, this is a big departure from the 1950s form of development that the US started, but really focusing on intersections to emphasize safety rather than speed. And one of the things that's really key that a lot of urban planners overlook is creating secure bike parking infrastructure. It sounds small, but it really is critical because oftentimes people are biking to transit hubs and then getting on things like buses or trains. So unless you have bike parking there, you're not going to get as many riders in public transit for commute. And related to that, you need to have additional bike hire infrastructure because you have lots of people visiting your city and you don't want them renting cars. So that includes hire infrastructure such as bikes themselves, but also docking stations and vehicles to transport bikes when there's a shortage in one part of the city. Third point on transportation. So while some vehicles need to operate in urban areas for health, safety, and freight use, really your mission as a city supervisor or an urban planner is you want to reduce the use of single occupancy vehicles. So considerations: vehicle fleets for the public sector as well as for larger companies should be electrified if they are still needed. This initiative could be compared with creating or expanding EV charging stations, obviously a needed component if you are electrifying your vehicle fleets. And this is what cities in France and Spain have done: experiment with bans on internal combustion engine vehicles, especially in city centers. But if bans aren't feasible, try creating fees or policies that at least greatly limit the number of cars in urban areas. And you can link this to especially when the air quality is pure, or is poor, not pure. Another key thing that's really important that a number of cities don't do is design freight vehicle delivery routes to be as efficient as possible. Strangely, the private sector is well ahead of the public sector on this, trying to create routes that are energy efficient and limit disruption to pedestrians. All right, moving right along, because I know we have a lot to cover and I'm sure you have lots of questions. Waste in cities, and really the elephant in the room is organic waste. Diversion from landfill waste stream and subsequent proper composting for organics will greatly reduce greenhouse gas emissions in urban centers compared to other waste diversion tactics. It's not saying don't do things like plastics or metals, but really organic waste in urban centers are the bulk of where emissions are coming from in the waste sector. A lot of that's methane. Waste and recycling programs that don't focus on organics will have simply a very minimal climate impact. That's because methane is such a potent greenhouse gas, and we produce so much of it from our waste, especially food waste. In order to do this, you need infrastructure for collecting and processing wastes. Again, this is when I lived in Toronto. This was just a picture outside my apartment building. And the nice thing about organic waste is there are byproducts you can make on it, from composting to biogas. Some of that you can use for electricity generation. Yes, that is still producing fossil fuels in some ways, or not fossil fuels, it's certainly still contributing to greenhouse gases. But you can do it in a little more efficient ways to try and create a circular economy. One of the things that I think countries like Denmark is doing a really remarkable job on is implement recycling requirements for lumber. So don't just take wood to landfill, see if what you can reuse from demolition or construction sites. And a lot of diverting organic waste in cities requires behavior change. So really, cities that make a big impact on this have a successful educational campaign that targets a wide section of the general public, not just school children. Okay, linking a little bit to the talk I'm going to give tomorrow, urban biodiversity. What can forestry do? Well-designed urban forests can create carbon sinks. The neat thing is they can also reduce urban heat island effect and therefore reduce the energy you need for cooling. So again, it's this idea of what we call co-benefits. The thing about planting trees in cities is that it's still one of the most cost-effective methods for controlling carbon dioxide, even when you need to have staff employed to plant and maintain urban forests. The thing to keep in mind is not all trees offer the same carbon sink benefits. Often you have to be site-specific and use native trees that are selected for carbon absorption and that protect local ecosystems and native species. Trees do improve air quality, so oftentimes particulate levels on street-lined trees can be 60% lower than those without. Trees also buffer stormwater and prevent erosion. And many urban trees have a high mortality rate, which is really important because you need to be able to support tree survival if you're going to do this as an approach. If you can't, you're going to have a lot of very disappointed constituents and a lot of dead trees. One really effective thing that a lot of cities have used, including in Japan and Australia, has been public-private partnerships to accomplish planting. Oftentimes private donors will step up to pay for the initial trees and cities pay for maintenance. And also other neat thing about trees, I know you're an environmental program, so everyone's talking about how great trees are, but really there are a lot of co-benefits, and scientific studies have shown that trees have a positive impact on health. 10% increase in urban green space from a recent study in the United States often postpones the onset of health problems by up to 5 years. And these include issues like or conditions like asthma, skin cancer, and stress-related conditions. They also tend to be reduced crime levels. We don't know why, but what we see is a high correlation between reduced crime and urban green space. So I know that was a lot to cover in a very short amount of time, and you're probably tired, but I want to end there